Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores human behavior through a behavioral science lens. I'm Kurt.
And I'm Tim. We like to explore the whys behind our human behavior with researchers, authors, and practitioners in order to bring those insights to you.
And we are lucky enough to talk to some of the brightest people on the planet, and we get to talk to them about things that make a difference. Things like power and influence, Tim.
That's a great lead-in, Kurt, to this conversation, because we are sharing with you today a conversation we had with Julie Battilana. She is the Joseph C. Wilson Professor of Business Administration in the Organizational Behavior Unit at Harvard Business School and the Alan L. Gleitsman Professor of Social Innovation at Harvard Kennedy School, where she is also the founder and faculty chair of the Social and Innovation and Change Initiative. Holy cow.
Not too shabby of a resume. Not shabby at all.
Nope, not a bit.
And our conversation with Julie focused on power and influence and movements and all of those things that impact us. And she brings a very practical, insightful manner to this conversation into what can sometimes and often is a very academic or intellectual conversation.
I definitely agree with that. This is a conversation that would be very useful for anyone who is in a leadership position. We also wanted to remind people that if they are interested in leadership, they can check out the Behavioral Grooves website and look up the Leading Human playbook that we have available there.
Yeah, Leading Human explores the human challenges, the stresses of working in a hyper-dynamic world, and it not only provides insights on how to be a better leader in these times, it goes beyond just the theoretical, and it actually gives you exercises that you can do with your team to make sure that you are being the most effective leader possible. If in this ever-changing world, having a deep understanding of how to apply behavioral science insights to better lead your team, well, Tim, I think that's pretty important.
Agreed again, Kurt. Leading Human is a book really in two parts. It's a playbook that provides you with the insights on understanding the issues and the science surrounding them, and a workbook that gives you the tools and exercises that can be used with your team to examine those issues and to develop solutions. Combined, they can improve your team's habits, communications, psychological safety, and ultimately their sales and productivity.
Yeah. And while you're out on the website, you can also sign up for our totally free newsletter.
Wait, is that free?
Free, totally free, Tim. No cost at all to anybody.
Our newsletter is named Groovy Snacks, by the way.
Which is a great freaking name.
Fantastic, especially since you thought of it.
Well, there you go. I wonder why. There you go.
Well, it's just a once-a-month compilation of great articles and insights, both from our guests, but also from around the world of behavioral science. And it will help you be more informed as well as maybe have a fun read every now and then. And it might even make you laugh. Maybe, hopefully more than that.
Hopefully. So feel free to check it out after you sit back with a strong pour of influential brew and listen to our conversation with Julie Battilana.
Julie Battilana, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you. Delight to be with you today.
It's a delight for us to have you today. Kurt, you want to get started with the speed round?
I'd love to get started with the speed round. All right. So, Julie, coffee or tea, which would you prefer?
I don't drink coffee,
Okay.
which is very un-French of me.
Yes.
I have to say that, as you can hear to my accent, even though I'm talking to you from Boston today, I am not a pure Bostonian. I am a French-American Bostonian. Now, if you were to offer me tea, I would politely accept, but I would prefer to have herbal tea if possible.
So do you live a life without any caffeine?
So, I seem to be a high energy person. So I don't know if I don't like too much caffeine or it is that my body cannot take too much caffeine. So I do not really try to stay away from it, but I don't particularly enjoy tea nor coffee.
So do you have a preference in the herbal tea? Is there a brand? Is there a style that you prefer above all?
Hibiscus or ginger or something?
So that takes me back to my childhood in France.
Oh, no.
And yes. So there's this very special brand called Saveur du Soir that, is well known in France. And I actually like the mint licorice herbal tea.
That sounds wonderful. That sounds absolutely wonderful.
Gosh, we could spend an hour talking about that, but we do have other things to cover. So would you prefer to have dinner with your favorite athlete or favorite musician?
I would love to invite, like people in both categories. If I had to pick, I would probably go for one of my favorite musicians, a Belgian musician. His name is Stromae. He's a songwriter and a singer. And what I like about Stromae is that each of his songs tells you this really intimate personal story, but that somehow has a universal component to it because it relates to important social phenomena happening all around us. What I like about him too is that he's combining many different genres of music. And so each song has a very special universe from a musical standpoint, and the sonorities are very unique. And I would love to get together and have dinner with him so that I could better understand the creation process, how he's writing, how he's composing, how he's relating all of the songs to what's happening around us in the world, and doing that in such a masterful way.
Wow. I love that. That's an explanation. Yes. I want to have dinner with him too.
We should make that happen.
Well, there we go. We should do that. We could have. That's our next podcast kind of thing. Dinner with our guests and the person that they chose, and we can just record that. There we go. Okay, so Julie, you've done a lot of research on power and different things, but power and authority, pretty much the same thing, right?
Oh no! I'm so glad you're asking the question, Kurt. So I've been teaching, researching on power dynamics in organizations and in society, and advising people over the past 20 years. And I've done that. And my dear friend and co-author, Tiziana Cachario, with whom I've written the book Power for All, has done the same. And one of the reasons why we decided to write this book is because we've come to worry a lot about the misconceptions people have in mind about power. And one of those misconceptions relates to the confusion between power and authority. And so you cannot imagine the number of people who come to me and tell me things like, power is not for me, because at the end of the day, it's for the presidents, for the CEOs, for the top executives, for the generals, for the prime ministers, and so on. And I'm not one of them. But here is the thing. Power and authority are very different. What is power? Power is the ability to influence other people's behavior. And what is authority? Authority is the formal right to give orders and commands. Now, in some situations, being in a position of authority and having that right to give orders and commands can indeed give you power. But being at the top is never a guarantee of power. So many top executives, CEOs, even members of governments I've talked to, come to meet with people like me, they close the door, and behind the door, they say, I feel powerless. Because they know that changes are needed, but they're not able to influence other people's behaviors to make the changes happen. So you may be at the top and have the authority. And in some situations, you may have a lot of power, but in others, you may actually not have the power that you need to make change happen. And conversely, you may not be at the top. And yet, you may actually have a lot of power. And I have a great story I'd love to share with you on that.
Yes, please do.
If I can.
Yes.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So you're getting the French accent. I guess I have to take you to France at least once, in our conversation.
Excellent.
So I'm going to take you to France, and I'm going to tell you about a study that a group of French researchers conducted in the 1950s. It's one of the studies we mentioned in the book, and we talk about it in chapter 4. And so these French researchers at the time wanted to understand the factors influencing the productivity of workers on the floor of factories. So they contacted a company named La Ceta. That was a company that produced cigarettes at the time. The first day they started their study, they did what we often do in those situations with researchers. So they met with the leadership of the organization. They asked for the organizational chart, and the leadership gave them the organizational chart. And then they went to observe what was happening on the floor of the factory. And they observed for a few days. And after a few days of observations, they actually asked to meet with the leadership of the factory again. And here is what they told the leadership of the factory. They said, well, you probably gave us the wrong organizational chart. So at that point, the leadership was quite annoyed because, as you can imagine, they actually didn't have multiple organizational charts. They only had one. And that's when the researchers said, but that doesn't make any sense. According to your organizational chart, the workers are reporting to foremen, who are reporting to middle managers, who are reporting to top managers. But the issue was that the researchers explained that anytime a top manager, a middle manager, or even a foreman would come on the floor of the factory and ask the workers to do something, the workers didn't seem to care. But when the maintenance workers in charge of fixing machines would come and ask the workers to do something, the workers were not excited. They were pretty frustrated, but they would immediately comply. The issue, though, was that the maintenance workers were as low in the hierarchy as the workers. So now the most powerful people in this organization were the lowest in the hierarchy, the maintenance workers. So now the researchers started thinking about how can that be the case? So they went back to the floor of the factory, they further observed, they interviewed people, and that's when they understood that machines on the floor of the factory had a bad tendency to break, right? And the only ones who knew how to repair machines were the maintenance workers. Now, the maintenance workers didn't have the kind of ethical approach to it that you would hope for. What they actually did is that they knew that they were the only ones who knew how to fix machines. And they were very careful not to share any information at the time with anyone as to how to fix these machines. But where did their power come from? They controlled access to one of the most valued resources in the organization, a machine that worked. And this is precisely what power is about. If power is about having the ability to influence other people's behavior, the question is, where does it come from? And now we can understand with this example where it comes from. It comes from control over access to resources others value. And the maintenance workers in that case controlled access to a machine that worked. They had the knowledge to make that happen. And that gave them a great deal of power. So they had no authority, but a lot of power.
Oh, wow. That is fascinating. And both Tim and I do some work with organizations. And one of the things that we've done is done some elements where I thought you were going with this was with the social dynamics and how, again, there's those interconnections between people. And sometimes it is that it's the gatekeeper that has the power. It is the person who is most socially influential who has the power. But this is fascinating. It's just a really interesting piece to say that, yeah, that org chart that we all look at and we think isn't really how power is actually distributed throughout an organization.
You're right, Kurt. And in fact, you're touching on something critical, because if the first step is now we've established that, right? Look at the organizational chart, but don't assume that it's telling you who has power and who doesn't. Like, it's just telling you who has authority and over whom, right? Now, if you want to understand who has power, then you have to ask the critical question: what is it that people value? And who controls access to these valued resources? And that's what's going to enable you to map the political landscape. Now, you're right, Kurt, to point to the fact that relationships, right, your network of relationships can be a critical source of power. And in fact, in our research, Tiziana and I've asked the following question: who are the most effective change makers? And that's probably related to the work that you and Tim have been doing together, right? And we've actually had the opportunity to conduct this study at the National Health Service. This is the British healthcare system, right? And so it's a huge bureaucracy, like a set of organizations. And so we had this opportunity to study a very large sample of change initiatives over time in the National Health Service. And so what is it that we found? We found that the most effective change makers were actually the people who were central in the network of their organization. And what do I mean by network centrality here? They were the people to whom others went for advice. And what we see in other contexts is that these findings can be replicated. The most effective change makers are very often the people who are central in the networks of an organization or a sector of society. Those are the people others trust. And trust is a huge conduit of influence. And interestingly, we found that those central players were more effective change makers regardless of their position in the hierarchy. So again, authority was not the key source of power for these change makers, but really the trust that they had established, because people go to them because they value the advice that they're giving them, and they know that these people will have their interest at heart.
You know, Julie, we often think about power, or I tend to often think about power as having influence over others. But is our drive for power also to some degree related to the desire to have a freedom from the influence of others over us?
Yes, absolutely. If you think about some of the fundamental needs that we have a need for autonomy, right? And it is true that if you want to ensure your autonomy, then you want to know that you're going to be able to accomplish some of what you want to accomplish, and that you will not be manipulated by others, and you'll be able to do that. And for that to happen, you're right to say that you indeed need to have some power so that you can follow the path that you want to follow. Now, when it comes to this need for autonomy, one thing I want to insist on, Tim, because I think it's critical, is that we have to remind ourselves that we have this need for autonomy and others have this need for autonomy too. And I work with many leaders, managers who from time to time lose sight of that. And they actually think that their role as a boss is to just be out there and be very clear as to what people should do and how they should do it. And they become very controlling. Instead of sharing the power that they have to truly empower the people they work with and enable them to pursue their objectives with the autonomy they need, they tend to want to, again, control every aspect of what's done by the people on their team. And they think that empowering them, relinquishing some of the power that they have. It's not the case. The truth is that people want to work with people who respect their autonomy. And when you truly empower the people you work with, this is when they will want to work more with you.
So, Julie, I'm 54 years old. I've been in business now for 30 plus years. And the idea of micromanaging has been a negative thing for plus 30, well before I got into business, right? And yet, as you're saying, it still is happening. Is there something innate in our nature that lends itself to being a micromanager, wanting to control everything? Why can't we get over this? In other words, right? It has been known that is probably not the best way to manage for a long, long time, and yet we still seem to do it.
It's an interesting question, Kurt. And I think there are multiple layers that we have to consider. Why is it that we still have bosses who tend to micromanage? And why is it that we still have bosses who, for some of them, abuse the power they have and then try to really control every aspect of the lives of the people they work with? If you think about it at the individual level, we all have different needs and wants. And some of us have a really strong need for autonomy. And then sadly, in some situations, it can become pathological. And the need for autonomy, we talk about that in chapter 3 of the book, can become, in fact, a need for dominance. And we all can think of pathological leaders we've had the opportunity to interact with, work with, or, have as leaders of countries, look back in history, recent and old, and think about what's happening around the world today. So we all have examples in mind of people with this very strong need for dominance. And then what these people do, sadly, is that they tend to abuse the power that they have so that, they can fulfill that need for dominance. So some of those individual tendencies can play a role. Now, I don't think we can account only, though, for individual tendencies, and it's not the case for everyone. Again, you've also been working, I hope, with the leaders who didn't have these pathological tendencies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But still, you may have seen them from time to time engaging in micromanagement. And this is where I think we have to account for the role of the culture of organizations and also culture more broadly at the societal level. So some people just try to empower the people on their teams, but they can be part of organizations in which the cultures are toxic because, they actually reward the kind of abusing behavior instead of trying to sanction it. So we have to think about the role of organizations and their cultures. And then we should be thinking about culture at the societal level as well. Like a critical question for all of us is, what is it that we value in leaders? And what is it that we reward? And I think that we still too often tend to turn to leaders who send us messages that are of the kind of, you should pick me because I will protect you. I will give back to you everything you had and even more. And you want someone who can protect you and is projecting as much strength as I am. These people are not necessarily the ones we should be picking. We human beings have two universal needs for self-esteem and for safety.
Yeah.
So you can see the trap. Whenever someone comes and say, hey, I can give everything you need to you so that your self-esteem will be boosted and I can protect you because I'm so strong, the risk is that we pick these people to lead our organizations. The risk is that we elect them. And we do so without paying enough attention to not only that message of sending strength, but are they competent? Will they have the courage to implement the difficult changes? And do they truly want to empower others and to enable us to fulfill our potential? Or are they in these just to fulfill their own need for dominance. And if the answer is they're in this to fulfill their own need for dominance, then this is when we get in trouble. Because that's when our freedoms, our well-being in our organizations and more broadly in society can be threatened.
There is so much to unpack there. And thank you so much, Julie. That was a fantastic explanation. And I want to get to this idea of powerful leaders in a few minutes. But a lot of the book is really beautifully architected around people who are not in power and how to help them be powerful. We recently talked to Vanessa Bonds, who has just done some wonderful work on and emphasizing this idea that we can underestimate the interpersonal power of persuasion that we actually have. And so you elaborated on this. You wrote that those who are most powerful are also the most unabashed in leveraging their power to gain yet more power, while the least powerful feel most uneasy about getting out there and seeking the resources that they need. And Julie, I'd like to spend some time on this to get more of your focus on how do people who are the neediest, how can they start to, in a more powerful way, to accumulate and acquire the power that they need?
Tim, this is indeed a critical issue and especially if you think about the motivation for why Tiziana and I wrote that book. The motivation is tightly connected to the question you're asking. We entitled the book Power for All because think about it, Machiavelli, now more than 500 years ago, was writing for the prince. And so many of the books that have been written about power since then have been written for the people in power or for those who want to emulate them and can somehow see similarities between those in power and who they are and are sort of thinking, now I can become one of them, right? But we were not writing only for the people in power. We were really writing for everyone, including those who've been excluded from power and who've been excluded from power for a long time. And so what is it that's at the core of our message in the book? Well, I'm going back to the fundamentals of power, right? Remember where we started? If power is about the ability to influencing other people, then the question becomes, where does power come from? And what we explain is that power resides in control over access to valued resources. Mm-hmm. So I have power over you if I control access to resources that you value, and you have power over me if you control access to resources that I value. I may control access to a budget you need to complete the project you're working on. And if so, certainly if I control that budget, I have power over you. But in the meantime, you may be connected to one journalist I absolutely want to talk to, and you may be the only people I know connected to this journalist. And if so, you also have some power over me. So what is it that you understand when you understand the fundamentals of power? You understand that power is not a possession. It's always relative. And I may not have any power over you today. It doesn't mean that it will remain the same for the rest of eternity. Right? Could actually change tomorrow. And in the same way, you may have a lot of power over me today, but it could potentially change tomorrow. And so what does it mean for people then? It means that the first step for every one of us is understanding power, understanding how it works. Because then when you understand how it works, you can start thinking in any situation about what is it that people need and want, right? That's number one. And who controls access to these resources? And you may start realizing that even though you were thinking you didn't have much power, or maybe you didn't have any power, well, in fact, maybe you do. Because we, human beings, do not only value money and material resources, we do value them. Let me be very clear. But we also value other psychological resources. We were talking about it, autonomy, for example, affiliation, belonging, achievement, status, morality. Right? Think about some of the iconic change makers like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, more recently Malala Yousafzai, or Greta Thunberg. What do they have in common? These people have been standing for moral values that have enabled them to gather some of us who want to stand with them and be associated with them and with these values. And so we've sort of rallied behind them to pursue the critical, essential causes that they felt had to be pursued at the time and still has to be pursued today. So when you understand the fundamentals of power, you can read the political landscape and you can start thinking about what you can do to build a necessary power base. And you may not be able to do much alone, but there's a lot you can do if you join forces with others. So Tim, I'm going back to what you said, right? Which is, let's not be naive. If we're talking about, for example, all of the social movements, take Me Too, take Black Lives Matter, that are that have emerged to try and fight and try and disrupt unjust power hierarchies. The work they have to do is incredibly hard work. It's difficult work. It's work that takes a lot of time. Right? We're talking about work ongoing over the course of multiple generations to fight these unjust power hierarchies. And the reason why it's so hard is because power is sticky. The power hierarchies are sticky, partly because those at the top reproduce them. And as you said, Tim, those who are disadvantaged also end up playing a role in reproducing those power hierarchies, not that they want to, but when you don't have access to any resources and you need to survive in a system, you start thinking at some point, you know what, let me say to myself, it's fine. And let me try and survive. So now the critical thing is for people to understand power and then think about their sources of power collectively so that we can together disrupt the unjust and unacceptable power hierarchies, which again is hard work, but we know from history it's feasible.
One of the themes of the book was really this idea that individuals who hold power can be overthrown by many people banding together. And what you've just talked about here, this idea that we are more powerful as a collective than we are necessarily individualistic. Do you have a favorite story of how the many might have banded together to overthrow the few? Is there one that kind of stands out for you?
Here's what I would tell you. What I've seen in the research I've conducted on these movements and the power of collective action, the power of those collective social movements. What I've seen in my research is that for these movements to succeed, they need to not only agitate, which is sort of look at the existing status quo and then help everyone realize that the status quo is not acceptable anymore, but they also need to innovate and orchestrate.
Yeah.
And let me illustrate that with an example. So I'm actually not going straight, Kurt, to a success.
No, we're getting to these 3 points. This is perfect, actually. Yeah.
But I actually want to talk about the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Okay.
So, one of the more recent movements. And if you ask me, I would say, wow, what an effective level of agitation. And if you ask me, I would say highly needed agitation, right? The people who were part of the Occupy Wall Street movement were bringing everyone attention to the fact that, the level of extreme inequalities we had reached was not acceptable. And by the way, it's still the case today. And the pandemic, if anything, has reinforced these inequalities. So those are really serious questions that we have to address. But what's interesting is that at the time, they were very clear in articulating the grievances. They did that effectively. They mobilized a number of different channels of communication to mobilize people. And yet somehow the movement died. Right? It didn't lead to any kind of significant changes. Now, why so? Well, I would say because in fact, yes, there was the agitation and it's always needed. But what we didn't have at the time was a set of innovations, solutions to the problems where we could say, hey, this is where we could go. Now, it didn't mean that the innovation didn't exist at the time, but the people who were part of the movement didn't really seize all of those existing innovations and put them in a narrative sort of saying, this is what the alternative status quo could be. Now, I think the situation today in this pandemic era is different, and I'm hopeful that things are going to evolve in the right direction because we've now become more aware of alternative ways of organizing. Social innovators, environmental activists have been doing an amazing job at trying to put together the new novel way of organizing capitalism. So the innovations are out there. But now, again, a set of innovations without orchestration is a set of potentially great ideas, but without impact. And so what you need is you then need to have people work together, the orchestrators, to implement the innovations at scale. And in the book itself, it's in chapter 6, we actually give the example of Maria Rashid in Argentina, who has been part of the LGBTQ plus movement in Argentina for a number of decades and was one of the leaders who pushed for the legalization of same-sex marriage in Argentina, and she did that successfully. And what's quite unique about Maria and the people who've been working with her, all of the organizers, is that they were able to play the roles of agitators, innovators, and orchestrators. It was not an easy thing to do, but they were able to play all of these roles at once, and they succeeded in having the new legislation be adopted. But I think that's what's in it for every one of us, is that we all have a role to play. It could be that, Kurt, you're going to be more at ease being an agitator, and Tim, maybe you're more at ease being an innovator, and maybe I'm more at ease being an orchestrator. But we're all needed if we want to disrupt unjust power hierarchies, be it sexism, be it racism. If we also want to change the way we deal with environmental issues, this is such a huge crisis. Look at the Fridays for Future young people. They are agitating, and they know innovation and orchestration are also needed.
Yeah. Let's get back to the powerful leaders. And I was wondering if you've got some observations about the power structure that's happening, the way power is being executed both by Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine and by Putin in Russia. Any comments just about the power issues there for the people versus the autocratic leader?
And for listeners, I'm not sure when this episode is coming out. We are in the it's starting the third week of the war that is going on in Ukraine right now. So
we are. And in fact, I, along with the rest of the world, have been horrified by the news emerging out of Ukraine over the past 2 weeks, right? Russia's unprovoked invasion of its neighbor is, of course, a terrible humanitarian crisis and tragedy. And I would say it's a very serious threat to the peace and stability of the global order. I think it's very clear to all of us now. Yeah. And there are some important lessons to be learned by viewing this crisis through the lens of power. It's interesting you're comparing and contrasting Zelensky and Putin. Let me start by saying that in one case, we're talking about a leader that's a leader of a democracy.
Right.
In the other case, as you were highlighting in your question, we're talking about a Russian leader who's the leader of an authoritarian regime. Right? So critical differences when it comes to the institutions in place. Now, Putin's behavior to me is a clear example of the dangers of unchecked power concentration. Over the past 2 decades, Putin has really tightened his grip on the political landscape in Russia. I don't pretend to know the specifics of Putin's mental state, but what research in social psychology has shown is that power does have strong psychological effects. Right? And in the book itself, that's where what we refer to as the infernal trio. What is it that power can do to us when we are in positions of power for a long time? Now, apply that to someone who has been in a position of power for a long time in a situation where the norm has become the authoritarian regime, right? So what is it that power does to us? When we are in positions of power for a long time, we tend to have less empathy. We tend to develop an enhanced sense of agency. And we also tend over time to start and, seeing our actions as legitimate, whatever we do. So now I would say all of that certainly applies to Vladimir Putin, who, is somehow convincing himself that, what he's doing is legitimate and that it's fine to take action the way he is and to impose the narrative he's trying to impose. And clearly his empathy is certainly not what you would expect it to be for any human being who would be seeing that level of suffering and be thinking we absolutely have to end that suffering and end it right now. Now, this is critical because this is the vicious circle, right? This is what can happen when people are in power and when dictators are in power. What we're seeing with Putin is not any different than what we've seen in history, which is when dictators are in place, these psychological processes kick in and kick in even more. So they start seeing everything they do as legitimate. They impose their views. And then in addition to that, the playbook of dictators has always been the same and will continue to be the same. Remember what I said, we human beings have 2 deep needs for safety and self-esteem. Mm-hmm. If your only objective is to increase your power and just continue to be at the center of a system in which you control everything, what do? You actually threaten people's safety. And you try to make everything related to their self-esteem dependent on you. This is precisely what authoritarian leaders are doing. This is what Putin is doing. And if you want to make sure that people are not going to go against you, what else do you have to do? Well, you control the narrative and you make sure to tell stories that legitimize everything you do. That's the power of legitimizing myth. We also talk about that in the book in chapter 6. And we're seeing what's happening in Russia now. This is what's happening daily, when you look at what is it that Russian people get exposed to through the media. They get exposed to the narrative that Vladimir Putin wants to impose in that environment, right? Now, if you compare that to Zelensky, in the case of Zelensky, again, you have someone who's been elected. He is representing his people, and clearly he's rising to the occasion in a quite extraordinary way. Like, he's in a very difficult situation, demonstrating empathy and humility, but he's also very clear about the fact that he's going to be in this with the people of Ukraine, and that they're going to be fighting to defend their rights and freedoms. And so instead of threatening, he's trying to inspire people to be out there and stand with him and all of the other Ukrainian people. As we discuss this crisis, I want us to be also very, very careful. There's no blaming of the Russian people there. Again, in general, there are a number of Russian people who had the courage to, under this authoritarian regime, go out there and demonstrate. And we all know that they went straight to jail. Some people are also not aware of what's happening because of the propaganda we were just discussing.
Yep.
So this is a very complex situation for the people of Russia. And I'm sure that many of them will be absolutely heartbroken when they're going to learn about what was really happening in Ukraine as they were fed all of this fake information about the reality of the situation.
Julie, do you see any concern or have any concern in regards to, with today and the technology that is there, of the ability to track how people are, what they're saying online, and a variety of other factors, as it goes to people in power and governments that then hold that, then is it less likely for people to be able to band together to take those people in power down because some of the technology that's in place? I don't know if you've done any research or if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, we discussed that in the book too. If you think about digital technologies, and if you think, for example, about the power of social media, what's interesting is that all of those technologies and all of the tools have been used by movements.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes in quite successful way, as a way to especially agitate, but not only, sometimes also to innovate and to orchestrate change adoption. So there's no doubt that the social media and the digital technologies can be leveraged to accelerate movements for change. Now, that being said, when you talk to leaders of movements, and in the process of writing the book, we've actually interviewed more than 100 people across the world to give life to all of our research, other people's research on power. And we've talked to a number of organizers and activists. One of them is Latasha Brown, who's the founder and leader of the movement Black Voters Matter. And when you talk to Latasha and other activists and organizers, what they put emphasis on when it comes to the social media and digital technologies is that, yes, those things can help because they can help you share your message, disseminate it. But we have to be very careful because there are risks associated with the use of these tools for organizers. One is the echo chamber phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Yes, I may be disseminating my message, but if I disseminate my message only in a small group of people who all agree with me, we're not making any progress. And by the way, the risk is increased polarization because, as we know, and that has been shown by research, we live in then different bubbles online, and it becomes harder and harder for us to talk. And so that can be an issue. The other thing, and that would be a potential trap for organizers too, is that trying to organize online only is not enough, right? You also need to organize in person. You also need to bring people together so that you develop the sense of common identity that's needed so that people continue the hard and long work of going against the existing power hierarchies. So that was a way to try and be a little bit positive in starting with the positive side of things as to what organizers can do with the tools. But Kurt, I heard your question, which was really about, now what about states and especially authoritarian regimes? Now they can use the access they have and control they have of all this information online to actually prevent people from launching movement, to control what's actually seen and heard and listened to, and make sure that some people just disappear and that their voices are not heard. Again, this is the playbook of all of the dictators we know over the world today. That's exactly what they're doing, and that's exactly what's happening. So do I worry about it? Yes, this is indeed very worrisome. Add to that fake news, and then you have a recipe for disaster. This is why I think that within our democratic societies, for those of us who are fortunate enough to be part of democracies, we have to be extremely careful, and we have to be very vigilant and exercise a civic vigilance we all need to exercise to make sure that we collectively keep control over, access to all of these technologies, and that there's a real freedom of speech and that it's being respected across all of the different platforms. Now, I want to add to that my worry is actually not only related to states, and especially authoritarian ones, when it comes to the use of those digital technologies and how they can be used to control people. I also worry about the power of big tech.
Mm.
And that's something that applies to democracies, that applies to the United States as well. If you think about it, we talked about the fundamentals of power, and I said power is about control over access to valued resources. Now, you do have a number of large tech companies today that actually know everything about our needs and wants, and they know that better than we do, right? Which is kind of unheard in history.
Right.
And we also know that they can, through the use of algorithms, influence what we need and want, shape what we need and want, and then provide to us for a profit what they made us want and need.
Right.
So
Right.
This is a very scary situation. And I think that Europe has taken action on that front, with all of the legislation related to the protection of personal data. And I think this is a critical thing that we all have to pay more attention to. And I think that when it comes to algorithm, we also have to all pay more attention, in the same way as you have, public entities responsible for regulating access to medicine and paying attention to how, a given treatment is developed and whether you can give access to people to that treatment without threatening their lives. We should be having, an entity responsible for screening and evaluating and understanding and reviewing those algorithms, because I would personally want to know how they were developed and what they're going to make me do or not do.
Right. Because we can't do anything about them if they're all buried. They're all underground.
Absolutely.
That reminds me of something that you brought up the city of Siena, and you talked about the 9 as this wonderful governing factor, because you talked about regulation and this whole idea of the 9. It was this 15th century, Italy. These 9 people in the city only had power for 2 months at a time. This very short. So they set up a system that said no one's going to get addicted because it keeps changing out. I guess I think about like term limits today in the U.S. Congress, but I also noticed that the 9, this model only lasted about 60 years. And I wonder, they accomplished a tremendous amount during that time, but why didn't it last longer? And I wonder if there's an allegory to today, to thinking about term limits and setting up systems that limit our influence.
Checks on power are absolutely critical. And so term limits, that's definitely one of those. And I described to you the infernal trio, right? What power does to us. And what I want to insist on is that no one is immune to the dangers of power abuse. And I think this is absolutely critical to keep in mind. I talked about people who've been in power for some time and start thinking that everything they do is legitimate, who then also think that it's great for them to take action and who have less empathy. I should also add, and we know that from research, that when we are in power for long periods of time, that's when we become more hubristic. So now, think about the mix of all of these things. You start thinking, oh my gosh, aren't all these people lucky to have me?
Mm.
Because I'm so good and I can save everyone. And I should just be imposing my view of the world on everyone because everyone is so better off, thanks to me. And so, yes, again, absolutely term limits, because and we explain that in chapter 2 of the book, if 2 of the main poisons of power are hubris on the one end and self-centeredness on the other end, the question becomes, how do you counter them? And I'll tell you how. This is based on our research and other people's research. If you want to counter the poison of hubris, you actually have to cultivate humility. And if you want to counter the poison of self-centeredness, you have to cultivate empathy. And when our leaders cultivate humility and empathy, this is when they start viewing power as a responsibility. And this is when they're able to have a collective orientation. Now, the thing is that over time, because of the psychological processes I described, no one is immune to losing sight of the importance of humility and empathy. So I would indeed never take the risk of letting people in power for a long period of time. Because if anything, then we expose ourselves to the risk that, one of them, or maybe 2 of them will at some point say, people would be better off if instead of having this democratic system, I declared that I'm going to be the one in charge. A lot of the dictators who have, created so much harm in history were elected. Not all of them, but a number of them were. So we have to be very, very careful on that front. And that's something we insist on in the book as well. Obviously, cultivating humility and empathy is critical. But back to your point, this is not enough. The institutions, democratic institutions, have to be preserved and enhanced. And that's about term limits. That's also about preserving the separation of powers, judiciary, legislative, executive. Those principles are central. And the other thing we have to do is we have to hold those in power accountable. And that's our responsibility as citizens. And when we don't do that, we again expose ourselves to the risk that some people are going to accrue ever more power and use that power in evil ways.
So with all this discussion about the challenges that we have in our world today, the book is still optimistic. Power for All is a very optimistic book. You end certainly on a very optimistic theme. Julie, can you just share maybe some of that message of optimism and why you feel like it can get better?
I think it can get better because it's up to us. It's up to us to decide, right? Remember the two questions. What do we value and who controls access to the valued resources? We have decisions to make. We are still at a moment in time when this paradigm of neoliberalism, that has been dominant, continues to dominate. And the characteristic of neoliberalism is that it has focused all of our attention and energy on maximizing on one dimension, profit, and more broadly, financial value. Now, it's up to us. What will we value in the future? Are we going to just double down and continue with a system that's just about financial value and profit? Well, my hope is that we won't, because if we do, this is all documented now in research, in economics and in sociology, across the field of social sciences. If we were to stay the course, we would further increase inequality, further destroy the planet, and further threaten democracy. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. And many, many people who are part of those movements for change that we've been discussing are currently pushing for us to change our culture and to change the systems associated with that culture. One example is that you now have a lot of people pushing so that in the future we're going to hold companies accountable not only for their financial performance, but also for their social and environmental performance. And we give the example of Gene Rogers in the book, who created the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board that has been part of this whole movement to create metrics to measure the social and environmental impact of companies, right? This is just one example, but that's my way of saying that what makes me hopeful on that front is that, yes, there is agitation, but now we also have the innovations of the kind of the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standard Boards. And you can tell that increasingly civil society, governments, companies themselves are working together, realizing that we cannot stay the course. We have to save ourselves. We have to save our planet. And importantly, and my hope is that this is why this book is really for all. It's not only for those who've been excluded from power. It's also for those in power. Like those in power, those who concentrate all the wealth in their hands, they have to realize that it is in their interest to make change happen too and to share some of that power. Why? Because what we know again from research is that when the levels of inequality become too extreme, that's when societies become unhealthy. Mm-hmm. That's when they become less productive. That's when they become less safe. And so you may have a large slice of a pie, but the pie is shrinking. And so it's in everyone's interest now to push for the change. So I'm also hopeful because, listen, I work with a lot of social change makers across the world. I created the Social Innovation and Change Initiative at Harvard University. I work with a lot of young people who are making the courageous choice to be part of all those movements for change. They want a fairer distribution of power in society. They are saying enough is enough. We have to put people and the planet at the heart of our economic system. And I have great faith in these young people. I'm not naive. Again, we know about the challenges. No. Power hierarchies are very sticky, but change can absolutely happen. And maybe if you allow me to, maybe what I would do is end with a story on that front. It's one of the stories we have in the book. It's the story of Nezuma Njube. We talk about her in chapter 7. And it's a story about how technologies can be used to actually redistribute power and do that in an effective way. And so I vividly remember the first time we met Nezuma. Nezuma lives in Tanzania in a remote rural area. And when we met, she was explaining to us that when she was growing up in her village, her dream was to become a teacher. And she was never able to go to school. And then we asked her about power. And here is what she said. She said, Julie, I for the longest time in my life felt I had no power. And I think I quite objectively had no power because think about it. All the decisions were made by the powerful members of the village council. And I was not a member of that council. And in fact, she didn't remember that a woman had ever been part of that village council. And so even though Nezuma felt quite powerless, and as she said, was objectively quite powerless, right, for the longest time in her life, in 2016, her life radically changed. She went from feeling and being objectively quite powerless to becoming one of the most powerful members of the community. Now, how did that happen? It happened because she encountered the path of an organization called Barefoot College. That's an international NGO. And Barefoot College has developed this truly innovative program that enables women across the global south to become solar engineers over the course of 5 months through learning by doing and peer-to-peer learning, even when they are illiterate. So Barefoot College came to Nezuma's village. They explained that they needed someone to volunteer to study for 5 months, and that after this person would come back to the village with all of the equipment to electrify the village and bring electricity, reliable access. That was missing. The members of the village council immediately said, yes, we want to do that. So men raised their hand. And that's when Barefoot College said it will have to be a woman. That's when Nezuma raised her hand. And Nezuma actually then ended up going to the city and studying. As you can imagine, her husband at the beginning was not in favor, but the members of the village council worked together with the Barefoot College representatives to convince him. So she went to the city, she studied, she came back, she electrified the village. And she didn't only literally bring power to the community in doing that, she also became one of the most powerful members of the community, right? And in fact, she became so powerful that she was later asked to sit on the village council. And now she had authority as well. And she's very proud to be representing the interests of women on that village council. And that's happening for the first time. And I wanted to end with this example because, again, there are ways in which we can change existing structures of power. And yes, technologies can also help us do that. But the solution is never purely technical.
Yeah.
It's political. It has to be intentional. It takes work. It takes, again, agitation, innovation, and orchestration. But when it happens, it can radically change the face of our communities and our societies. And so that's why I'm hopeful.
Yeah.
You should be hopeful, and especially with all the enthusiasm, we are hopeful as well. And I don't have an easy segue, but I'm really curious about your playlist. And we're hopefully coming out of a couple of years of pandemic. And I'm just wondering, is what you're listening to today any different than what you've listened to over the past couple of years? Or
interestingly, what I'm listening to today has a connection, in fact, to the pandemic. I'm going back to the musician I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. I've been listening over the past week a lot to Stromae, this Belgian singer and songwriter. He has a new album entitled Multitude that just came out. So he's singing in French. And as I mentioned early on, I like the storytelling associated with every one of the songs. And there's one song in particular I've been listening to, and I want to mention. The title of the song is Santé. And the song actually came out at the end of 2021 and is part of this new album that, the album itself just came out a few days ago. And it's a special song to me because it's an homage to all the essential workers whose work is taken for granted, who are too often treated poorly in service jobs. And so he, in the song, is raising his glass to those who do not have one, to the people who prepare our food, who take care of everything that has to be taken care of so that, we as a society can be resilient. We can all do what we have to do. And so that's a beautiful song. And my hope is that we are not going to stay at the discourse level and talk about the importance of essential workers, but that we're not only going to continue to listen to those songs like this one that I think is a great one, but that we're actually going to empower workers and not only raise the salaries, but also give them a voice and a say in the strategic decisions of companies. And I've been part of a movement on that front called Democratize Work. That's all about giving more power to workers. So that's what I'm listening to, and that's how it's connected to the pandemic.
I love this idea of santé, which is what the French say when they're toasting. You're holding up your glass. You're going to toast. You're embarking on something new, and it is an honor. And I love that he wrote the song called Santé. That's terrific. Julie, this has just been a delightful conversation. We are so grateful to have you as a guest on Behavioral Groups. We hope you come back and join us some other time.
Thank you so much for having me. So enjoyed discussing everything with you.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our discussion with Julie, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our powerful brains.
Yeah.
Power-filled brains. That's what I should have said. Not powerful, power-filled.
Both,
brains.
Right? Our brains are both powerful, and they can be power-filled with Julie's, coaching and support. And her directive is everybody should feel powered, should feel enabled.
Yeah.
Go out and do it.
Yeah. Well, and I like this idea that power and authority are not the same thing, right? That while authority is the right to give orders and commands, power is really the ability to influence people's behavior. And I love that differentiation.
I liked it too. And I also like the way she framed power as coming from sort of the control over resources that other people want.
Yeah. And resources often, I think resources often, it's like, oh, you have these things, but sometimes resources are information, sometimes they're charisma, sometimes they're social aspects. So power is a multifaceted aspect that I think is really, really cool.
Yeah. So your own skills,
yes.
your own strength, the things that differentiate you can be resources that can make you powerful. Mm-hmm. I just want to encourage people to do that.
I know, and I wish I had some of those so I could be powerful.
I do too. I wish you had some of those too.
Oh man! So what else, Tim? What did you like?
I really like the way Julie packaged this agitation, innovation, and orchestration stuff. This whole idea of breaking down, because it's really easy to think about movements in terms of these three aspects, right? If we think about Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter. Agitation, man, they're really good, right? They're doing a great job on the agitation. They're really getting the word out. They have huge social media stuff. They broadcast their messages just magnificently. When we get to innovation, like actually developing the solutions, a little weak there, not so strong on the solution development and orchestration, actually implementing these ideas, bringing these ideas to life. They're just thinking about these two examples, not super strong on actually manifesting these important concepts that they were behind.
And I like this idea too, because while we talked about these large social movements, as you said, BLM and Occupy Wall Street, the same aspect though can be about having a movement within your company, within your organization, whether it be a company of 100 people or a company of 5,000 people or your local community, PTA board, right?
Right.
You need to be thinking about what is it? It's almost like you think about the hero's journey and how a story is a narration, right? You have the issue. That's the agitation. What is this piece that is getting people worked up? And then you have to figure out a solution to it, right? And then, all right, once you've figured out that solution and an innovative solution, not just the way that it's always been done, you have to think about things from a different perspective. You have to bring in different insight in order to make it so that it's compelling for people to join in. Because if it's the same old, they're not going to join in. Same thing in a story you've heard before. Well, it's pretty boring, right? You're not going to be involved in it. And then finally, you have to actually have some culmination. You have to actually have it do something. You need to bring this together into this, as she says, orchestration is making these good ideas come to life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. For some reason, while you were saying that, I was thinking about a couple of things. One is John Levy's talk about influence.
Oh, yes.
And when he talks about, so we can't do it all. We're not going to be the most influential person in every situation. So we need to align ourselves or develop relationships that can help us be influential. But he said, let's say you're buddies with Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook. But what you really need is to get your daughter into a really good daycare. Mark Zuckerberg is not the guy that you want to help influence that, because he's not going to have any influence over the daycare, right? You kind of have to be thoughtful about where you want to exert power and influence in your life and sort of what's appropriate for that context, for that situation.
Yeah.
So if you want influence over the daycare, you should probably see if you can get on the board or, do some volunteering there or something.
Julie talked about this as in movements and in power and different things. But if you take this agitation, innovation, orchestration model, even in your own life, I mean, think about this from a motivational perspective, right? This idea of what's going to motivate. Well, you got to be agitated, right? You don't have to be, but if you're agitated, you're going to be more motivated. And then you got to, what's the innovation part? How is this being exciting for you? What are you doing that's new, that's different? And then you get the progress part. The last part is this progress part. So it's kind of this. I'm taking this model and applying it probably in ways that it shouldn't be applied. But man, this is pretty cool.
I like it. Can I rant for just a second on growing up? I remember hearing the comment that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Okay.
Julie just made that come to life in spades, right? Like she, the psychology behind it is really, really clear.
Yeah.
She talked about the infernal trio. That's what really hit me. It's like, wow, she can really identify the negatives that power has on people, on individuals who are in power.
And long-term impact, right? This idea that you lose the sense of empathy that you might have had coming into this powerful position, enhanced sense of agency that, hey,
anything I do is great.
This idea that I'm all power, that I say it and it gets done, right? And a tendency to see one's own actions as legitimate, regardless of whether those actions are good or bad or even indifferent. You always see them as being, well, of course they're good because I did them.
Right. Right. Lacking in complete objectivity. The whole world becomes this big subjective, experience for you.
Which I think is a really good kind of marker for us to be saying that we need to be very wary and watchful for this. Mm-hmm. And I look at current events and you can just see this happening. You can see it in the world stage with Putin, who has now been in power for a long time. And he has pretty much absolute power over kind of that role. You look at the Congress today in the US, and you look at people who have been in those positions for not just 10 years, not just 20 years, 30, 40 years for some of them. The average age of a U.S. senator, I think, just keeps expanding older and older and older. And this idea that we have to be really careful that people who have been in these situations and these powerful positions, that they can have the best intentions in the world, but this is stuff that happens. And so, and we've talked about tribes, and we've talked about in-groups and out-groups and Democrats versus Republicans and all of those different pieces. Yeah. And we actually should be more concerned about those within our own party or our own tribe, because those are the ones that we would tend to overlook, because some of the things that they might be doing are there. But that's where we need to be wary.
The sword cuts both ways. And it leads me to ask you this: what can we do about it?
Well,
where should we start, I guess?
Well, I think, we can set up systems. So one of the things that Julie talks about is this idea of setting up systems to give people power who don't have power right now. Because that's one of the things. Power is kind of this self-fulfilling kind of thing. I have power, therefore I can set up the system and the things in order for me to maintain that power. And so the more that we can do to break that cycle, to make this so that all of a sudden we are it's not just the powerful who remain powerful, but you can bring others into this power mix, the better that we can do.
The Barefoot College example was great, where they set up a system that said, we're going to come into your village, we'll bring solar power to you, but the representative who learns how to run it has to be a woman.
Yes, yeah. I love that. Yeah. So think about that. Think about how you can set up systems within your own organization, within whatever community work that you're doing. If you're in a leadership position, how do you give others power? And I think set up those so that can happen. And then I think the other piece, at least in my perspective, is take those movements, that idea, this agitation, innovation, orchestration, and utilize that, right?
Right.
And bring that to bear you can change that. So that's the dog in the background.
Here we are.
There we go. So anyway, you can take that and you can utilize that in order to initiate the changes that are necessary.
I think we also need to get beyond this idea that agitation is enough. Just coming up with a whole bunch of ways to stir the pot are really good. Movements have to get beyond this. They need to think more in terms of, okay, so as a collective, we can stir the pot, but what's the point of it? What's the solutions? What are the things what are the policies that could come from this, or the new rules for engaging our own employees? You know, if we really want to stir the pot, what's the point of it?
Yeah.
And then develop some way of manifesting it, bring it to life in some way.
Yeah.
Have a way to get to the other side of just an interesting idea, because interesting ideas die on the vine.
Yeah.
You got to put it into action.
Yeah. And then I think we ought to make leaders for life. What do you think? Once you get in that position, leader for life, done. You got it. And it passes down to your children and their children's children.
No, we didn't get enough time to talk about this in our conversation with Julie, but I love the part in the book where she talks about the 9, the ruling group in Siena, that every 2 months, one of these 9 members has to retire. You know, they're done. Like they get 2 months and then they're done.
Yeah.
And you go, wow, like if you're vested for 2 months, you are not going to build systems, you know, that basically line your pockets for the long term.
Yeah.
Because you only got 2 months. So power should be temporary.
Yeah. So leadership should have term limits. They should have some components that are like saying, hey, how do you get out of this? Not only how do you get into this position of power, but then how do we make sure that you are leaving? And I think it's one of the great things that USA did. And I go back and people ask like the favorite president. And I always point to George Washington, just because he, at that moment when he said, I'm not running for a third term, it was like, what?
Right.
Like you're giving up this power, everything voluntarily.
Yeah.
And the idea that then that was kind of the precedence that was set and how that worked, I think is really key. And so, yes, we need to be able to think about how do you put in these elements that are going to allow people to leave and set the precedent for them to leave in a way that is easy and good and makes it happen. So,
interesting question to leave with. If you live in the United States, who's your favorite president? If you live in a country with a prime minister, who's your favorite prime minister? And is that a person who adhered to power, who clung to power, or is it someone that got up and walked away from it?
Ooh, good question. All right. I think that's a good point to wrap all of this up, Tim. And as always, thank you for listening. And please, if you want to reach out to us on social media, we would love for you to do that. We are always looking to have conversations with you, our listeners, to find out more about how we are doing and what you would like to hear from us. If you have ideas on who we should be interviewing, send them our way. If you want to talk about some of these concepts that we just talked about from Julie or any of the other conversations, hey, send us a tweet, get us, message us on LinkedIn. We talk about this stuff. We like to talk about this stuff.
We love to talk about this stuff. Yes.
So, yeah.
And we truly appreciate you spending time with us. And we hope that you've learned something that maybe you could actually take out and use. So hopefully this week you can go out and find your groove.